There are moments in history when a single building becomes the center of an entire city's attention, when the ordinary is stripped away and replaced by something raw, immediate, and impossible to ignore. On May 7th of 1931, a five-story rooming house on West 91st Street in New York City became exactly that. Hundreds of police officers surrounded it. Thousands of civilians gathered. And somewhere inside, a 19-year-old with two pistols waited. He was bleeding and defiant and convinced of something that would haunt everyone who later heard the story. To understand the moment, you have to step back from the gunfire and look at the path that led him there. The young man, rather small in stature, who was inside that apartment was Francis Crowley, who was born October 31st, Halloween Day of 1912 in New York City. He's quite young still. He entered the world under difficult circumstances, the second son of an unwed mother who gave him up for adoption. His grandfather had been a police officer. That's a detail that feels kind of ironic in hindsight. And he was eventually raised by a woman who took him in. Stability was never quite part of his story, though, even then. By the time he was a child, education had already slipped away from him. He made it only as far as the third grade. Now, keep in mind this was almost normal at the time. Childhood education wasn't a mandatory thing. My own grandfather only made it to the third grade. But he only made it to the third grade as well. So reading was a struggle for him, as it was for my grandfather. Writing was barely within reach. My grandfather had my grandmother write all of his letters for him. By his late teens, Crowley was not simply just another troubled youth. This man was known. He was not famous in the way that brings about admiration, but he was recognized in the way that makes people feel uneasy. There were whispers around about him. There were reports. There were encounters that left people kind of shaken. He moved through the city with the kind of restless energy, and as the months passed, that energy turned increasingly violent. On February 21st of 1931, that violence broke into the open at a dance that was hosted by the American Legion in the Bronx. It was supposed to be an evening of music, movement, and ordinary joy. And instead, it became the first clear sign of what Crowley was capable of. He arrived with two other young men, uninvited, and when the Legionnaires tried to remove him, Crowley responded not with words, but with a gun. Shots rang out. Two men were wounded. Panic replaced the music. And Crowley disappeared into the city, leaving behind not just injuries, but fear. From that point forward, the pattern just accelerated. Less than a month later, on March 13th, police confronted him. The encounter ended with the detective Ferdinand Schadel, shot and wounded as Crowley escaped into an office building on Lexington Avenue. 2 days after that, he had several accomplices, and they carried out a bank robbery in New Rochelle, New York. The crimes were not isolated incidences either. They were part of a growing chain, each link stronger and more dangerous than the last one. Then came the apartment on West 19th Street and the man named Rudolph Adler. Adler was a real estate broker. He was a civilian whose life had nothing to do with the world Crowley was creating. But when Crowley and his companions broke in, Adler did what many people hope they would do in a moment such as this. He resisted. This man fought to protect his home, and for that, he was shot 5 times. It's easy to say those words quickly and to move past them, but each single shot did matter. Each one carried its own weight. Adler survived, surprisingly enough, but survival does not erase what happened in that room. The violent interpersonal, close violence of it all. And then there was Trixie, Adler's dog. Not a very large animal. This dog was not trained for combat. The dog was just there. And when Adler was attacked, the dog, as dogs often do, responded with instinct and loyalty, and with the courage that forced the intruders to retreat. Good dog. In the chaos of that moment, it was Trixie who changed the outcome, who created enough disruption to give Adler a chance to live. And as the robbers fled, one of Crowley's accomplices shot the dog. It's a small detail in the larger body of the story, but this lingers, especially among animal lovers like myself, because it reveals something about the indiscriminate nature of this violence. Nothing was spared. There was no resistance. There was no innocence left behind. They took everything from this man, or at least they tried to, including his life. By then, the name Two Gun had begun to follow Crowley. It was tied to the image of him carrying multiple pistols, using them without hesitation. This boy thought he was Billy the Kid. But the Two Gun nickname sounded almost theatrical, but there was nothing theatrical about the reality behind this name. The violence continued. On April 27th, Crowley was riding in a stolen vehicle with Rudolph Fats Duringer and a young woman named Virginia Brannan. She was a dance hall hostess. The details of what happened next are as disturbing as they are simple. Brannan resisted advances from Duringer. In response, he shot her and killed her while she was still in the car with both of them. There's no way to soften that. There's no way to reframe it. Virginia Brannan's life ended in a moment that should have never happened in the first place. She was not part of a crime. She was not some accomplice. She was not armed. She was not a threat. She was simply a victim of someone else's decision to respond to rejection with violence. And Crowley was there. After the shooting, Crowley helped to dispose of her body near St. Joseph's Seminary in Yonkers. When the police found her, the urgency of this manhunt increased. There was no longer a string of crimes. It was something more serious, more dangerous, and far more immediate. On April 29th, Crowley was spotted driving a green Chrysler Imperial in the Bronx. It's a nice car. Pretty easy to spot. Police pursued him. What followed was a running gun battle through the streets. Bullets struck other vehicles. Officers returned gunfire, and once more, Crowley escaped. By now, he's thinking he's invincible. The next day, his abandoned car was found, riddled with bullet holes, blood visible inside. Investigators began connecting the evidence. The bullets matched. The crimes aligned. The pattern was clear. The blood was not his. It was the young lady's. Then came May 6th, the day before the siege. Crowley was sitting in a parked car on Long Island with his 16-year-old girlfriend, Helen Walsh, when the police officers approached. There were two of them. Their names were Frederick Hirsch and Peter Yodis. They were doing their jobs and they asked for identification. That was it. Crowley responded with gunfire. Officer Hirsch was killed. Officer Yodis was wounded. And Crowley, once more, fled. This moment matters because it represents the point where the stakes become absolute. And a police officer had been murdered. The search for Crowley became relentless. Which brings us back to May 7th of 1931. Crowley, Walsh, and Duringer were tracked to a fifth-floor apartment on West 91st Street. The building belonged to a former lover of Crowley's who, upon seeing him with another woman, she notified the police. It's a detail that feels kind of personal and small and petty, but it set in motion one of the most dramatic standoffs the city has ever seen. She did the right thing, even if it was for petty reasons. Outside of the building, nearly 300 members of the New York Police Department assembled. They brought rifles, they brought machine guns, they brought tear gas with them. And they were not alone. Word spread quickly. By the time the confrontation began, an estimated 15,000 people had gathered, watching from the streets, from windows, from anywhere they could find any kind of vantage point where they could see what was going on. And inside the apartment, Crowley prepared for a fight. The exchange of gunfire lasted for nearly 2 full hours. Police fired hundreds of rounds into the building, and walls splintered. Windows, of course, shattered. Tear gas was introduced through a hole cut in the roof, filling the apartment with choking fumes. And still, Crowley resisted. He returned fire. He moved within the space. He relied on Walsh and Derringer to reload his weapons. At times, he even threw tear gas canisters back toward the officers, and he was wounded multiple times. His blood loss was significant, but he did not surrender immediately. He was pretty stubborn. And then in the middle of all of this chaos, something happened that continues to unsettle anyone who hears it. Crowley sat down to write a note. In it, he claimed that he had a tender heart, and I'm quoting that, and that he would not harm anyone who did not harm him first. Think about that for a moment. This was written after the shootings, after the break-ins, after the robbery, after the killing of Virginia Brannon, after the killing of Trixie the dog, after the murder of Officer Hirsch, after the wounding of others, after all of this. And that note was later found stained with his own blood. It was not a performance for a crowd. It was not shouted. It was not broadcast. He wrote this quietly in the middle of a firefight, as if he believed it completely. Eventually, the standoff did end. Crowley, who was by now weakened by his severe injuries, surrendered. Officers found 2 pistols strapped to his legs as he was taken into custody. And the crowd that had gathered surged forward, trying to catch just a glimpse of the young man who had held off the police for so long. The trial, of course, moved quickly, as things did back in 1931. On May 29th, less than 3 weeks after his arrest, Crowley was convicted and found guilty of the murder of Officer Hirsch. Derringer was convicted of the murder of Virginia Brannon, and both of these men were sentenced to death. Crowley was sent to Sing Sing prison in Ossining, New York. Even there, his pattern did not fully break. He remained difficult. He caused disruptions. He damaged property. He fashioned makeshift weapons. But as time passed, there were reports of a change, or at least a sense of a softening. He kept a starling that flew into his cell, and that was an odd detail that contrasts sharply with everything else that we know about him. He became the bird's keeper. But on January 21st of 1932, Crowley faced execution. His final words were directed at the electric chair itself. Referring to Derringer's earlier execution, he asked for a rag. He said he wanted to wipe off the chair after that rat had sat in it. It was a final moment marked not by reflection or apology, but rather of his internal anger still. And Crowley, if you didn't do the math earlier, was 19 years old in 1932. That's where his story ends, but not where the questions end. Because when you look at the full arc of Francis Crowley's life, what stands out is not just the violence, but the contradictions. Here's a young man who could write about having a tender heart while leaving behind a trail of victims. He was a teenager who believed he was justified even as the evidence mounted against him. A person who moved through the world with a version of himself that did not match reality. And perhaps the most important part of the story is not the siege or the gunfire, or even the headlines that followed, but the people whose lives were altered or ended along the way. Rudolf Adler, who survived but carried the memory of that night for the rest of his life. Virginia Brannon, whose life was cut short in a moment of cruelty. Officer Frederick Hirsch, who never returned home. Peter Yotis, who lived with the aftermath of his injuries. And even the smaller details, like the dog that intervened and paid the price. History often remembers the central figure, the name that appears in bold print, the person at the center of the event. But the true weight of the story, like this, is carried by those around them, by the victims, by their families, and by the quiet absences left behind, by the man who reaches out to pet his dog. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to leave your answer in the comments. When someone can look at their own actions and still believe that they are the victim, what does that reveal about human nature, and how should society respond to that kind of thinking before it turns into this kind of a tragedy? And if you enjoy stories like this, of course, make sure you follow the Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify and YouTube so you never miss an episode. Those subscriptions really do help. Thanks for watching.